Peter, I think you're.
Good evening. My name is Mike Abramowitz, and I direct the museum's William Levine Family Institute for Holocaust Education. I am thrilled to be here tonight to introduce this fabulous set of panelists and to introduce what will surely be a provocative conversation. Tonight, we will discuss one of the gravest issues a U.S. president can ever face: mass slaughter of peoples in far-off places and what we as a country ought to do about it. You need just peruse our leading newspapers to get a flavor of the stakes. Bureaucratic debates rage about how to save threatened populations. Interest groups press the White House for bolder actions. Politicians and citizens worry that national security will be compromised if immigration quotas are lifted. I've been particularly struck by some of the headlines from one of our country's major newspapers. Refugee problem entangles Europe, says one headline from the New York Times. Refugee problem vast and profound, reads another. No, I'm not talking about the Syria crisis of today, but instead the United States 75 years ago, as the persecution and extermination of Europe's Jews accelerated in the 1930s and 40s. The question of what to do about the threat of genocide has long vexed occupants of the White House. Consider how two of our most recent presidents, President Bill Clinton and President George W. Bush, have expressed regret and second thoughts over their handling of crises in Rwanda and Darfur, respectively. Today, President Obama grapples with how to respond to humanitarian crises, not just in Syria, but also Burma, Sudan, and the Central African Republic. In a speech several years ago on this very stage, he announced the creation of an atrocities prevention board to anticipate and prevent the worst of these crimes. The policy debate over how to respond to genocide has its roots in the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the subject of our panel discussion tonight. The topic is of intense interest to our museum. Not only is it addressed in our permanent exhibition, but it will also be a focus of our next special exhibition, Americans in the Holocaust, to open in April 2018. In this exhibition, we will explore the range of American responses to Nazism, from the president to ordinary citizens, as well as those rare individuals and institutions who acted to help. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have a distinguished panel to explore the figure of President Roosevelt during the Holocaust and his influence on decision makers today. Jay Winik, a best-selling author, addresses the subject in his new book, 1944, FDR and the Year That Changed History. Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent of the New York Times, offers us a contemporary perspective from his work on more recent presidents. And Richard Brightman, one of the most respected scholars of this period, addresses it in his award-winning book, FDR and the Jews. We are also very fortunate to have a terrific moderator, my colleague Edna Friedberg, one of the museum's senior historians, to whom I now turn. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much, and welcome to all of you. And I'd also like to thank our panelists for joining us. I'd like to ask you to imagine. Step outside on a clear evening like tonight, and you will see the planned cityscape of Washington, D.C. in all of its symbolic glory. The giant statue of Thomas Jefferson gazes past the Washington Monument directly to the Oval Office. Legend has it that President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had cherry trees removed from the tidal basin so that he could observe the construction of the Jefferson Memorial with binoculars from that office. I don't know if it's true, but the sightline is certainly there. On April 13th, 1943, the 200th anniversary of Jefferson's birth, and right in the middle of the war, President Roosevelt dedicated the completed memorial. Addressing thousands of spectators and millions more who were listening by radio, Roosevelt proclaimed, Today, in the midst of a great war for freedom, we dedicate a shrine to freedom. 50 years later, almost exactly to the day, this building in which we meet tonight was dedicated. A memorial which, unlike its neighbors, testifies to the world's failure to defend human freedom and dignity. This is a structure intentionally designed to disorient and discomfit. A building with a twisted skylight, with a ruptured floor, with doors and windows leading to nowhere, and an uneasy feeling of being watched. The ghosts of American actions and inactions during the Holocaust continue to haunt us today. This is a museum in the American capital about what was an overwhelmingly European event. Tonight, we will explore why that is so, what American values really were at the time, and what presidential leadership means to us beyond monuments of pillars and stone. Now, for decades, we've been scrutinizing FDR, perhaps over-scrutinizing him, conflating him sometimes with the entire federal government, using him as a stand-in for American morality in the period. I'd like to start with you, Richard, to ask you why you think that is, why this intense focus, and what gets lost when we reduce complex history to a single person, no matter how powerful or influential that person.
We think of Franklin Roosevelt as one of our great presidents. He was, of course, the only four-term president. We think of his administration pulling the country out of the Depression. And of course, contemporaries weren't as aware as we are, that Roosevelt was doing all of this while handicapped. And then came the war, and he managed the war to a successful conclusion. So the impression is easily created that here was a super powerful president who could do what he wanted. And that wasn't really true. It was true to a degree in the first 100 days or so when everybody else was willing to defer, but it very quickly changed. And Roosevelt frequently had trouble with Congress and to a degree with the public at large. And so we look back and we see the achievements and the power and the image of a president more powerful than perhaps anyone other than Lincoln. And we forget about the messy details and all of the fights and the limitations.
You mentioned Lincoln, who Jay has also written about. Care to weigh in?
Well, can you all hear me? All right. And I'm looking at these bright lights there. When I think of Roosevelt, I think of him as really being a feast of a character. I think of him as being larger than life in just countless ways in all the little details. In many ways, he had the charisma and charm of a Thomas Jefferson. He had the populist impulses of an Andrew Jackson. He had the persona of a George Washington. And nothing seemed to be beyond his reach or beyond his fertile imagination. His mind and his ability to see over the horizon seemed to encompass everything in front of him. What do you say about a man who was crippled and yet somehow got elected not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times? What do you say about a man who, when he couldn't walk into a crowd on his own steam, but he was in constant motion, he tilted his head back, he used his hands? What do you say about a man who uplifted the hearts of all Americans, or so many Americans, with his fireside chats? I mean, he really was an extraordinary president, and I think it's not for no reason that we see him as one of our 3 greatest presidents, right behind George Washington and Abraham Lincoln.
Well, I would add to that if I could. First of all, thank you for including me on this panel. I feel like this is the old Sesame Street song. One of these things is not like the other. We've got three extraordinary and eminent historians here, and you've got me for comic relief. But it's a wonderful treat, and I think it's a terrific topic to explore and to connect to today's events, as Mike did earlier. Mike and I, by the way, covered a lot of this stuff together when we were at the Washington Post, and Mike wrote some of the best stories about President Bush and Darfur. And I think that in answer to your question about why we personify the entire federal government into a president, it's only FDR is personally responsible because, of course, he intended to do that. He made himself to be the personification of the government. It was part strategy, part nature to him, I think. And every president since then has only increased that. We forget that the framers made Article 1 about the Congress. They thought Congress would be the major power in our government. That's not true today, obviously. And that's accelerated and exacerbated by the media, which finds it much easier to focus on one man as opposed to 535 individuals, right? Even the 535 individuals, as we see this week, can't seem to quite focus on themselves in a coherent way. And so there's both the reality of a more executive-focused government and then the mythology of an executive-focused government. And I think the presidents both benefit from it because they get a lot of credit for things they don't have much to do with, and they suffer from it because we expect out of them things that they can't. The one thing, when George W. Bush left office, he told an aide who asked him, he said, what surprised you most about being president? He says, how little authority I have. And I think every president in modern era has discovered that as well.
But nonetheless, one thing that can be added to that, and you and I both knew President Bush quite well, is he had the authority to take us into war. And it's on the issue of war and peace where the president really can stand supreme. And to be sure, there's always a question of, does Congress declare war to legitimize what the president wants to do? But it's one man sitting in the Oval Office wearing that kind of heavy crown, as it were, feeling the tension, who can really define what we do in war and in peace, with the Congress kind of nibbling at the edges.
So you mentioned war. Not all of Roosevelt's tenure was in a time of war. And Richard has written about 4 Roosevelts in a way. I'd like to talk or have you comment a little, if you will, about the arc of his presidency, how his leadership style changed, how he engaged with refugee crises before and during war. Run with it wherever you'd like.
Okay. Franklin Roosevelt in 1933 looked at Europe, saw Nazi Germany, was unhappy to aghast, and didn't feel he could do very much. And in the first term, Roosevelt stayed out of European troubles, in part because he had his own agenda. He felt his job was to save the country, to protect democracy, and to put people back to work. And foreign policy crises could only get in the way. When he was reelected in a landslide in 1936, he thought that was his last term. And at that point, he began to try to create a record in foreign policy that at least approached what he had done domestically. He was hamstrung by a Congress that was significantly isolationist. He gave a speech about quarantining aggressors, and he got so much flack that he immediately backed off. Nonetheless, he tried in 1938 to change immigration policy in such a way that we could at least take advantage of space under the German immigration quota. And he tried to sponsor other countries, a conference at which other countries would take in Jewish refugees from Europe as well. That was the second Roosevelt. Then came the war. And Roosevelt decided that he was going to run for a third term because he was capable of handling the crises better than anyone else that he could see around him. And the third Roosevelt backed off of what the second Roosevelt had done. He became worried about security issues, and he became worried about the politics of supporting Britain before the United States entered the war, and then the politics of managing the war. That third Roosevelt, unfortunately, lasted until the middle of 1943, at which time a number of things happened. Maybe we'll talk about them. But certainly the war began to go much better. And some people got to Roosevelt and persuaded him that he couldn't wait till the end of the war to begin doing humanitarian things, particularly with regard to the Jews. And that led to the creation of the War Refugee Board in January of 1944. And one of the elements of the board's activity was to sponsor sending Raoul Wallenberg to Hungary. We're here on Raoul Wallenberg Way, and so we know something about Wallenberg and his activities, but not everyone remembers that that was an outgrowth of the War Refugee Board.
You know, I'm struck when you're talking about Roosevelt, pre-war Roosevelt, that in a way his isolationist, or characterized as isolationist tendencies, are just part of a longer American tradition. I'm reminded of George Washington's farewell address when he cautioned against entangling alliances, and that America was not a superpower in that time. I think that for those of us who have grown up in recent decades, there's a tendency to reflect back from our position of power now. What's your take on that, any of you?
Well, if you're asking me, the United States in 1940 had a smaller army than Belgium did. We don't think of that much these days, but that was the reality. And it took well into 1943 before the United States military was the equal of some of the others on the battlefield.
The one thing I would add to that is that whatever else may be said about our state of preparedness, and it was woefully inadequate as the storm of war was beginning, is geographically, in terms of our military capability, politically, we had this, what would eventually become this giant, vast arsenal of democracy that could gear up. And we were the superpower that would either come to the rescue of the world or not come to the rescue of the world. And you know, there's a very interesting kind of turn of the historical, I guess the historical wheel, that when one thinks about as early as 1933, FDR comes to power, and so does a man named Adolf Hitler. And in Germany itself, many people thought of Hitler as being a kind of Roosevelt for Germany. He built highways, he improved their economy. He did all sorts of things that seemed in their eyes very Rooseveltian. But he also started doing some other things that just didn't quite sit well in terms of the norms of war. He created a camp called Dachau, where they put political prisoners, and this was not the way to do things. And Winston Churchill, who was a very keen observer of the scene, and of course they were closer geographically to Germany than we were, is he said to the German ambassador one day, he said, "You tell Chancellor Hitler that what he's doing with the Jews may be a good start, but it's not a good finisher." And he was saying that this is beyond the norm of acceptable behavior. And that would become a problem that would vex Roosevelt to varying degrees. And we could get into that as we unfold in our own evening tonight.
Well, I think that one of the things that we talk about, this idea of responsibility or entangling alliances or what have you, right? FDR in World War II was really the turning point. Before World War II, there is a sense of isolation or separation. We have the two oceans. After World War II, we are the home of the United Nations. We are the dominant power in the free world, and we create NATO and so forth. And it's never going to turn back. But you hear the echoes of that debate today. You actually heard it today, actually, in the Rose Garden. You know, Vice President Biden today announced he will not run for president. But when he did that, he gave the speech he would have given had he decided to run for president. And one of the things he said was, we shouldn't be out there trying to solve all the world's wrongs, in effect. He said, we've learned our lessons, should have learned our lessons in the last 10 years, and we shouldn't be so quick to intervene in other countries' problems. Just because something bad happens doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to go fix it if we can't. Who is he talking about? He's talking about Hillary Clinton, of course, who has a different view within the Democratic Party, one of more hawkish, to use a phrase, interventionist, the idea that we should be doing something more, for instance, in Syria. Syria is the case study of modern America for where do we intervene, how do we intervene, what is our responsibility, what are the lines we draw. And that is a shame in a way that he didn't run for the sake, if for no other reason, that would have exposed a very interesting debate within the Democratic Party. Republicans have their own debate about the limits of intervention, the range of American role in the world, and all of which echoes, I'm not going to pretend to be an FDR expert compared to these two terrific historians, but all of it seems to me to echo from that era.
I think it was Roosevelt who convinced the country that the United States had to be a world power. And it was a fight. It was a fight with the isolationists. It was a fight with Congress. And it was particularly a fight in the period from 1939 to 1941. Churchill was beseeching Roosevelt to
Churchill was desperate. He was
to enter the war and save Britain.
Save us.
And Roosevelt was not convinced that the country was behind entrance into the war. And he waited, and he waited. And then came Pearl Harbor. Of course, he wasn't entirely waiting. He was aiding Britain with that economic might that Jay spoke of. And particularly, he fought with Congress over Lend-Lease to supply the kind of equipment that Britain desperately needed. And then came Pearl Harbor. And still, Roosevelt waited. He waited to see whether Germany would declare war on the United States. And it did. And at that point, it was easy, not only to get Congress to declare war on Germany, but it was easy for Roosevelt to prioritize the war in Europe, something that he would have had great difficulty with if the United States had acted first against Germany. And, you know, this is all about history and morality, but we also have to look at the effects of decisions that are not strictly moral decisions. They're practical political decisions. One could make the argument, I mean, this is only a small part of the story, and we are critical of Roosevelt as well as complimentary of Roosevelt in the book by Alan Lichtman and me. But one could make the argument that Roosevelt's decision to give priority to the war in Europe saved more Jews than any other conceivable measure, because if we had emphasized Asia, the war in Europe would have gone on much longer and the Nazis would have killed more Jews.
This is where you have a point of view.
I guess the one thing I would say is that we come from Britain, we come from Europe. We're separated by an ocean with Europe, but we are, in many ways, we're cousins and we're brothers. And what one saw with Roosevelt, and it's important, I mean, my view is a little bit different, Richard, is that with Roosevelt, he was an extraordinarily gifted leader. And leaders have two options, particularly in times of crisis, particularly and especially in times of war, and in this case, a burgeoning world war. They can either lead or they can be led. And Roosevelt was very deft at shaping and molding and manipulating public opinion. I mean, it's not for nothing that people huddled around their radios, listening to his fireside chats. He uplifted the hearts of Americans during the darkest days of the Depression, and he was able to sort of shape where we were going to go. Roosevelt interestingly enough, for all his ability to move public opinion, to move the American people, he was a consummate politician. He was worried about getting too far ahead of public opinion. Now, was he always right to do so? I think sometimes yes, sometimes no. I think with the case of the Jews, it was tragic, and I think he was too little, too late. But he was careful and he was cautious. And there's almost this puzzle. I mean, you have this man who is so gifted and so good at manipulating public opinion. Why was he so cautious? He was a politician to his core. And that's why, I think.
Well, you write in your book about, of course, the decision not to, or the failure to make a decision to militarily bomb Auschwitz, or the tracks to Auschwitz and so forth. That's a topic that's been debated, obviously, in many books and in many fora. I hear the echoes of that with Syria, with President Obama, for instance, was considering whether to have pinprick strikes. That was the phrase used on Syria for using chemical weapons against his own civilians. 4,000 Syrians were killed by a chemical weapons attack in 2013, including small children. The president talked about retaliating because he had set a red line. And he ended up not doing it. And I think in part, again, I hear echoes, right? He didn't think the country was behind him. He didn't think the country wanted to get entangled again in a Middle East war, and that this would get them entangled. And, you know, he would argue that by not striking and instead accepting this deal that the Russians brokered, in which President Assad of Syria gave up his chemical weapons, that we had a better outcome than sending a couple cruise missiles against the Syrian intelligence headquarters. But the problem was, for him, having set a red line and said he was going to do it and then not doing it, he created credibility problems overseas. So he's buffeted, I think, by these forces that politicians are often buffeted by, right? Public opinion. When do you follow public opinion? When do you lead public opinion? And what does that do to your moral standing in the world?
Right. The one thing I would say is that the Roosevelt that we see in America in 1939 was in a very different position than the Roosevelt in 1942 or 1943 or 1944. I believe that by 1943, the American people would have followed Roosevelt wherever he wanted to take them. They would have followed him to the edge of the earth and not to the edge of the universe. I mean, he was the man who, Roosevelt got them into the war. He kept the morale going. He kept the spirit going. And of course, Richard, you were talking about how we weren't ready early on in the war, and that's true. And Roosevelt very shrewdly held off. His generals wanted an early assault against the Germans with a second front, what would eventually become Normandy or D-Day. And in 1942, Roosevelt just felt we weren't ready. We didn't have the ability, we didn't have the training, we didn't have the military might. And so he came up with, out of his fertile imagination, the North Africa campaign. And Eisenhower, the great General Eisenhower, said that is the blackest day in American history that we did that. But it turned out that Roosevelt was right. He got us into the war, but in a way that could be manageable. He uplifted the morale of our troops, and he made Americans feel like we were in this fight. But once having gotten to that, at that point, they knew, I think, from my reading of the evidence, as early as 1942, we were going to win the war. It was just a question of not if, but it was a question of when and on what terms. And that is what the debate became over. But for the debate about morality versus security, or morality versus what was happening on the battlefield, it's very important that we have a kind of dynamic view, that knowing that 43 and 44 were very different from 41 and 42.
Richard, do you agree with Jay's characterization about the intense influence that Roosevelt could have had, that the American people would have followed him to that extent?
You know, we're doubles partners sometimes in tennis, so I absolutely expect he agrees with everything I say.
I passed the Trump International Hotel on my way here. We're not going to be trumping each other in this dialogue. I agree with Jay that Roosevelt could have and should have done more at the end of 1942 or earlier in 1943 than he actually did. And that is one of the Roosevelts we criticize in our book, The Third Phase. So we're not that far apart.
Right.
But regarding leadership, you can't lead simultaneously on a wide range of issues and carry everybody with you. Roosevelt felt that he was leading the democratic world against the Axis powers, and that this fight early on was going very badly. Even the North African campaign, when it was finally launched in November 1942, was a difficult campaign, and it bogged down. It didn't move quickly into Tunisia. So, you know, when Eisenhower got to Algiers, there were rumors among the local population that he was Jewish and that he had been sent by the Jew Roosevelt to establish a Jewish state, not in Palestine, but in North Africa.
If only it were true, right?
And this is the climate that we forget about. And this is some of the reason why Roosevelt was so hesitant on Jewish issues until the war began to go much better. And then he began to listen to his Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr., and others, and came to believe that the government was not doing enough and his own State Department was not doing enough. And we agree on that.
Right. No, Richard, I reread your book the other night. I sat down in the quiet of my own home and I just reread it, and I think we agree on sort of 98%. It's just some of the details and the emphasis that we might have a few little differences. One thing I want to say is about, you mentioned Lincoln before, and one point in my book, I talk about how Roosevelt may have missed his emancipation moment. And the one thing I want to say about Morgenthau, actually, I want to get back to Morgenthau for a second, is when Morgenthau Department wrote what has to have been the hardest hitting memo I can imagine ever sending to a president, it talked about the government's acquiescence in the murder of the Jews. Imagine that being said to any president, let alone to Franklin Roosevelt, the man who is seen as one of the world's great humanitarians, if not the great humanitarian. And he's being accused of, or his administration is being accused of, by his own Secretary of the Treasury, acquiescence in the murder of the Jews. That had to hit him like a shell.
Jay, I think the bureaucratic term for that is chutzpah.
Yeah, right. And you know, within a matter of days, that was when he met in the second floor Oval Office with Morgenthau, and that was when they set up the War Refugee Board. And around the same time, the Senate was going to move to debate this whole issue of could he be doing more. I want to get back to what I was going to say about Lincoln for a second. With Abraham Lincoln, he started the war over the Union, over keeping the Union intact. It was a war over geography. It was a war over knitting us back together again. And by 1862, as times changed, as things changed on the military battlefield, then Lincoln did something quite profound. He turned this war over geography and he turned it into a war over morality when he promulgated the Emancipation Proclamation. And he did this in spite of the fact that it was seen as a horror in the North. It was roundly criticized within his own political party. And even many within his own cabinet thought this was crazy. I mean, the idea that he would go to war or fight a war over what was seen in the time or in the day as the coloreds was just anathema. But at that point, he did it because it was right. And that is why Abraham Lincoln lives in our heart and he lives in our affections so deeply and I think so profoundly. With Roosevelt, he could have had his Emancipation Proclamation moment with the Jews, but he could never quite see beyond the exigencies of winning the war. His line always was, the best way to help the Jews was to win the war as quickly as possible. But as the nation put it at the time, and they put it very poignantly, they said, yes, that's if any Jews are left. And therein lies the dilemma for what we're looking at as we explore this, And therein lay the dilemma for Roosevelt in 1943 and 44.
Well, the dilemma is even greater than you indicate, because Nazi propaganda was telling the world, including the Middle East, that the Allies were only fighting a war because of the Jews. And so openly doing things for the Jews could be described as something that was inimical to the Allied war effort. And that was what all of the psychological warfare experts and all of the State Department people were saying. And so Roosevelt needed a push to overcome this. And he got the push from Morgenthau. But you were about to say something.
No,
Peter.
This is like watching a great tennis match. I think both points are really fair points, and I'm not an expert on history. I do think that what you mentioned, the emancipation moment with Lincoln. I think you're right that what he did was a moral right thing to do. At the same time, there was, you know better, right? But there also was strategic calculation, right? By issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he hoped to keep the Brits and the French out of the helping the Confederates, because if they were going to intervene, they were not going to intervene on the side of slaveholders, and he had to define the war in a way that kept them on the sidelines. So even moral decisions by presidents are backed up by, I think, strategic considerations that inform their thinking.
But I think with Lincoln, and what one sees is that what's happening on the battlefield can give running room to the president than to make other decisions. And I think strategic calculations might inform, but they don't dictate. Mm-hmm. And there were plenty of reasons. And if Lincoln were any other president and any other man, I do believe he would not have undertaken the same sort of a policy. And it was hard to do. It was hard to do, and it took great political courage, and it took great vision and foresight. And again, that's why he lives forever in our hearts, because he was able or willing to do things like that.
I would offer I agree with that, right? I totally agree with that. And again, you're the Lincoln scholar and I'm not. But if I remember correctly, the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves in the parts of the country he actually controlled.
Right. And
so there were moral, compromises, right?
But it was seen as freeing the slaves.
Yeah.
And those subtle distinctions were made by the London Times, for example, but they weren't made by most Americans. Yeah. Most Americans saw this as he's turning a war about union into a war for the colors. Right.
Gentlemen, I'm going to interrupt for a minute and leap us back to the 1930s because we could have a fascinating conversation on Lincoln. But there have been several references tonight to popular attitudes, and the 1930s was a period which saw a proliferation of public opinion polling. I'd like to toss out a few statistics and return to FDR, thinking again about his self-consciousness or reactions to popular attitudes. Roper and Fortune magazine did a lot of polling in the late 30s, and for example, they asked about how many respondents wanted to admit larger number of European refugees into the US. They took such a poll in May of 1938, which was just a couple of months after Nazi Germany's annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. And only 5% of American respondents wanted to admit more refugees at this point. They took the same poll in January 1939, so only 2 months after the widespread violence and mass arrests of Kristallnacht, and 83% of American respondents were opposed to admitting larger number of European Jews. The number that were for it had gone up a little from 5% to 9%, but this was the environment in which Roosevelt was operating. You could talk a bit about that.
The numbers speak for themselves. I'm not sure what I have to add, except to say that American attitudes during the war did not improve. There continued to be widespread opposition to immigration and widespread feeling that Jews in the United States had too much power, too much influence, and were associated with negative characteristics. This imposed a problem for even a great president, and it was not something that he could simply ignore. You know, on the question of leadership, I had an occasion to interview one of the heroes of the Holocaust, a man by the name of Gerhard Riegner, who sent perhaps the most famous piece of evidence about Nazi plans to the West from Switzerland. Riegner was a longtime official for the World Jewish Congress, and I interviewed him for this museum, actually. It's part of the museum's oral history collection.
And if you could
I
pull
said,
up a picture of Riegner, please. Go on, we'll get him up there in a second.
I said, what was your attitude towards Roosevelt, and what is your attitude today? This was in the 1990s. And he said, during the war, I had a picture of Franklin Roosevelt on my office wall. It helped me to keep going in the midst of the blackness that I was seeing around me and reading about. After the war, I learned that Roosevelt didn't do some things that he could have done. But you know what? One thing that Roosevelt did was that he supported Britain before the United States entered the war, and then in North Africa during 1942. And if he hadn't done that, the Nazis would likely have taken Egypt, Suez Canal, Palestine, killed all the Jews there, and there would be no Israel today. So I still like Franklin Roosevelt as a leader.
You know, this is an interesting conversation, and I've seen this on my book tour, that it's as if Roosevelt is a member of the family. And Edna, this is something I know you can personally relate to, because on one side of your family, they felt that way.
Yes.
It's as if he is a member of the family, our family, and it's not easy to criticize him. It doesn't feel right. It's like criticizing almost ourselves. But you can love a leader, you can admire a leader, you can revere a leader, but history demands, history not only for the past, but also for lessons for the future, demands a full and complete accounting. And I've always felt this way about Lincoln, and I feel this way about Roosevelt as well. I felt that in my book, April 1865, I wrote about Lincoln, and I was critical of him at times, more so than most of the standard Lincoln scholars. And I always thought that he grew larger in our estimation, even as he had his difficulties and his problems and his challenges. And I think so it can be with Roosevelt. I mean, with Roosevelt, it's very painful. He was the champion for the Jews in so many countless ways that we can both define and not define. But on this fundamental issue of the Jews and the Holocaust, as information dribbled out, and you were talking about the Riegner telegram, and that really comes out of, and you did some of the pioneering work on this, the Schulte revelations. He was a Nazi industrialist, a fierce anti-German, or anti-Nazi, I should say. And he heard about, in a little event with Himmler, of all people, in whispers, this thing called the final solution, this attempt to wipe off every Jew off the face of the map in Europe, every man, every woman, every child, every grandparent, every kid, because for Hitler, it was always about the children too. And so we just can't forget. I lost my thread of my thought there. I was going to do something complicated, but anyway.
I'd like to pull up one more slide. If we could get a copy of the Riegner telegram there, please. And the original of it, in which Riegner, among many warnings he gave, sought to warn Western leaders and alert the consciousness of nations. The original is in the collection of this museum. I'll read a bit of it to you. Western Union telegram, which he's sending, have received through Foreign Office following message from Riegner. He says, received alarming report that in Führer's headquarters plan discussed and under consideration all Jews in countries occupied or controlled by Germany, number 3.5 to 4 million, should after deportation and concentration in the East, at one blow exterminated to resolve once and for all Jewish question in Europe. This is from summer 1942. I'm going to read you another poll number to try to get your juices flowing. This is from early 43, so a few months after this cable is sent. A Gallup poll, again, asked average Americans, and I quote, "It is said that 2 million Jews have been killed in Europe since the war began. Do you think this is true or just a rumor?" Now, although in December 42, Allied leadership had publicly confirmed that 2 million Jews had been murdered, the poll found that only 47% of Americans believed it was true, 29% dismissed it as a rumor, and the remaining 24% had no opinion. Now, a major part of the reason for the public skepticism was, frankly, the failure of the American media to treat the Nazi genocide as a serious issue. As our punching bag journalist on stage here,
I have to say it wasn't
Peter.
me.
Yes.
Pretty sure. Well, you know, it's interesting. There is such deep skepticism even today. Some of it's, you know, some of you can certainly blame on the media about official representations about events that people can't see with their own eyes. And, you know, today, if we write a story about Iran's progress toward a nuclear weapon, we're accused of distorting intelligence or accepting a government that is distorting intelligence, much as some people will believe happened with Iraq a decade earlier. And we can argue about what happened with Iraq a decade earlier. I think there's, you know, certainly a case to be made that people who made the decisions in Iraq and about Iraq in 2002, 2003 genuinely believed the intelligence they were reading. You could argue that they should have been paid more attention to certain dissents or certain flaws in that intelligence. But I do think that they, in researching my book, which is not about FDR, I came to the conclusion that the policymakers genuinely believe that intelligence. Having said that, it's left such a sour taste in the mouths of so many Americans that they don't believe anything. If you asked a poll how many people believe Osama bin Laden is dead, or Osama bin Laden was killed in the way the government says he was killed, a certain percentage of Americans are going to say they don't believe it. And we wrote an article just this week in the New York Times Magazine, sort of putting out various versions as if they were all equal. No wonder the public is confused, because we the media have a responsibility to try to help the public sort through conflicting, sometimes information, difficult to understand or believe information, and help them come to the best conclusions on the facts, and they can make their own decision on then what should be done about it. Syria, again, we talked about that missile strike that President Obama talked about. Part of his issue was a certain percentage of the American public just didn't believe that Syria had actually used the chemical weapons on its own people, even though, you know, there are certainly more than enough evidence to indicate that. So FDR had to deal with that. I think every president has had to deal with that. And you're right, the media plays a significant role in trying to help readers make, come to the best conclusions they can.
And if I might add also, the American public at the time still had fresh in their minds atrocity stories from World War I, many of which turned out to be fabricated or exaggerated.
Yeah.
So that is certainly a factor.
Yeah.
It's not an excuse, but it's an explanation.
Yeah.
Jay, you looked like you wanted to say something.
In many ways, though, the media tended to follow what the administration was saying. And when the administration did come out with an announcement, I found, in my looking at the media, they were very eloquent and articulate in both in their rendition of the facts and their reporting. And if you look at, for example, how they portrayed what happened to the Jews en route to Auschwitz, I mean, it was really heartrending. They did a very impressive job.
Well, if I can get back to the Regner telegram for a minute, it's actually pretty revealing what happened to that telegram, both initially and later. State Department officials didn't believe it and did not want to send it on to the intended recipient in this country, Rabbi Stephen Wise. So they sat on it, they suppressed it. Wise got the information anyway from his British counterpart. It took some time, and rushed down to Washington and asked Sumner Welles, who was the one sympathetic person in the State Department, Wells launched an investigation that took far too long. But ultimately, Wells called Wise and said, our investigation confirms your deepest fears. And then he went on to say roughly the following: for obvious reasons, I cannot release this. But you are free to do so. It might even help if you did. And so it was Wise, a private citizen, putting out this almost literally incredible story of Nazi gas chambers killing more than 1 million or so. And that had to make some difference. And that really was a problem in credibility. So yes, the media was at fault, but the government was at fault too for not pushing the story aggressively.
And this is what Morgenthau called those terrible 18 months. Those terrible 18 months of bureaucratic indifference, those terrible 18 months of bureaucratic inactivity, those terrible 18 months of when Jews were desperately cramming consulates, desperate to somehow find their way to freedom, desperate not to end up on those trains to Auschwitz, and yet nothing happened.
I'd like to, in the few minutes we have left, talk a little bit about more recent, or even dare say contemporary events, because unfortunately almost every president since Roosevelt has had to deal with the threat of or the realization of mass atrocities. We have Nixon with East Pakistan, Ford and Carter, Cambodia, which you can see a display right outside of this theater, the first President Bush, the Kurds, Clinton with Bosnia and Rwanda, Bush, George W. Bush, Darfur, and Obama now with Syrian refugee crisis. To what extent, and this is maybe a question for you, Peter, having written about Clinton and the second Bush, do you think that presidents look back to history? Do they look to Roosevelt? Are they chastened by his experience? Are they inspired?
Oh, they absolutely are. There's no question about that. And this is a little, there's a story about George W. Bush is interesting. He wanted so badly, I think, to intervene in some way in Darfur. I think he felt very conflicted about that because he was very passionate about his anger at the failure of the UN to intervene or the failure of the world to intervene. But when he talked to his aides about what they could do, could they send in helicopters? Could they create a no-fly zone? Could they do this or that? He was constantly hamstrung by this idea that he would be, as he put it, invading another Muslim country. Right? Because we'd been in Afghanistan, because we'd been in Iraq, he believed and concluded that going into Darfur, even on a completely humanitarian basis, to save people's lives, would be perceived as once again big America taking on a Muslim country. It frustrated me to no end. But the FDR inspiration that comes to mind, there's a little moment that not a lot of people know about. He, in the midst of Iraq going badly and an inability to do something about Darfur, he was considering a program that his advisors brought to him to fight AIDS in Africa. And they were proposing something bigger than had ever been done in any public health effort by the United States government or the world before. And he was about to have a meeting, George W. Bush was, in the White House in the West Wing about it. And before that, it was near Christmas or near Hanukkah, near the holidays. He was meeting with some Jewish leaders who came in to visit him. And one of the leaders, one of the Republicans, it was a Republican Jewish leader, said to him, admiring of his efforts in Iraq to, in his view, topple Saddam and free the Iraqis from dictatorship, he said, if you had been president instead of FDR, there would be a lot more Jews today. Meaning that Bush was willing to do something to help people who were being oppressed by tyranny. Whether we agree with that or not, it had a big impact on Bush. He goes immediately from that meeting across the West Wing to the meeting on this PEPFAR program, that's the AIDS program. And in this meeting, you have all the traditional equities talking about what to do about it. Well, it's a lot of money, we shouldn't spend it, we can't use that much money, it wouldn't have that much impact. And he approved all of it. And his aides told me that they feel very strongly that he was so impacted by this idea of doing something to save the Jews, the Africans, the people overseas, that he was inspired to approve what is one of the better, one of the universally hailed elements of his presidency.
Jay, any final thoughts before, and then Richard, before we open to questions?
You know, I think of Roosevelt in 44 when the Polish Home Army rose up against their Nazi masters in Warsaw and fought bitterly and hard for several weeks. And Churchill was desperate to help them. And Roosevelt also wanted to help them. He wanted to help them for two reasons. One, because it was going to help him with his reelection in 1944. And secondly, because he wanted to show, yes, we stand shoulder to shoulder with the Poles in their time of need. And so we sent 107 flying fortresses to airlift material and weapons to the Poles in their time of need. And we did this, Roosevelt did this, knowing full well that it would have only a marginal difference. But he thought the symbolism of this was so important to show that we stand shoulder to shoulder with you. And then the question was on the lips of humanitarians at the time, well, if we can stand shoulder to shoulder with the Poles in their time of need, for God's sakes, can't we stand shoulder to shoulder with their Jews? And you know, near the end in 1944, as planes routinely flew over and around and near Auschwitz, and Elie Wiesel, the great Nobel Prize winner, the great moral conscience of humanity, he said at the time, he said, well, we may fear death, but not that kind of death. And what one sees, I believe, at that time, was something was on the lips of the Jews in their terrible, ragged state, those who were still alive, as it is on those oppressed people today. They all said the same thing. When will the Allies come? When will the Americans come?
In 1993, the Air and Space Museum held a conference about the proposals to bomb Auschwitz and Birkenau. And I was there. There were people associated with yes and people associated with no. I don't want to say it was an even split, but it was pretty close to an even split. It happens that I agree with Jay that Roosevelt's reputation would be better if he had pushed a plan to do this. But I resist the notion that this is the most important litmus test for the United States, because the Nazis had killed Jews before there were gas chambers and crematoria, and after they were all shut down, they continued to kill Jews. Joe White, someone who works for the Holocaust Museum, has written an article for the journal of which I'm editor, laying out what Nazi officials at Auschwitz would have done had there been an Allied bombing attack to try to destroy the reinforced concrete gas chambers and crematoria, an attack which might well not have succeeded. They were already preparing other ways to kill Jews. So I think it's fair to say, had they succeeded, this would have saved lives. I don't think it's fair to say this would have stopped the Holocaust, or this is the only way of judging the policies of the United States.
Right. No, but, and you know I'm not saying that. Right.
Got it. But there are some people who do.
I know, but I'm not.
I hope through our conversation tonight we've uncovered or reminded us all of the many complexities, the competing interests that a president has to juggle, and also to know that whether one seizes every moral or humanitarian opportunity does not mean that one has forfeited the chance to seize others in the future. And I think that applies to ordinary people as well as those in positions of great power. So I see hope and opportunity in some of the complexities, not just disappointment. We will now have some time for questions, but first I'd like to thank our panelists very, very much. If you have a question, and I emphasize the word question because not speeches, not proclamations, but questions for our panelists, I invite you to please approach one of the microphones so that everyone in the auditorium can hear. And I think we will take a couple at once and then give the panelists a chance to respond. Yes, sir.
Two very brief thoughts. No one has mentioned the Holodomor, the hunger, the forced famine in Ukraine that killed millions of people, and yet there was hardly any American awareness at the time, let alone a response. And my second point is, if you look at the Why We Fight series, it's absolutely silent about what the Nazis were doing to the Jews, perhaps deliberately, because of the fear that any impression among the American people that the war in Europe was fought primarily to save Jews might have compromised the war effort in Europe, in contrast to the war in Asia, which we got into because of an actual attack rather than a declaration of war. So I'd like comments on those 2 points.
Thank you. Let's take a couple. Yes, you too, sir.
FDR met with the Polish emissary Jan Karski at the White House. And when Karski explained what he saw his transit camp, he pretty much saw the final solution in action. FDR did about the situation of Polish forces in the countryside. So I wanted to know, was this a reflection of FDR's true indifference, or was FDR sticking to talking points laid out by his advisors? And your thoughts on that matter, please?
And I think if I could kind of reframe the first comment / question a little, I think you could get to the point about also to what degree were Americans in the time aware of what was happening in different parts of the world, and how did they assimilate that information? So
I would say real quickly on the Ukraine famine, that is an example of media failure. And you know, that's my newspaper, among others, failed to report what was going on. Walter Duranty was the New York Times correspondent in Moscow. You know, it's a mark of shame that he bought into Stalin's lies, in effect, and didn't believe that there was a Ukraine famine going on. And it's there's a great book about him that's worth reading. I'm forgetting the name of it right off the top of my head, but it's a terrible example where the media fell down on its job.
Want to talk about the meeting that?
The Karski meeting?
Yeah.
I heard part of the question, maybe not all of the question. So if you need to follow up, do so. Karski was introduced by a man named Oscar Cox, who was kind of well connected in a number of different government agencies. And he also met with Felix Frankfurter, the Supreme Court Justice, and then he got to Roosevelt. So Roosevelt probably knew something when he got there about what was going to be said. And I heard Karski talked about this meeting at a number of different times throughout his life, and sometimes leaned one way and sometimes leaned another way. I heard him say that Roosevelt was very interested in all of what he had to say, including about the Jews. And Roosevelt at the end was typically non-committal in terms of what he was going to do. But shortly afterwards, Stephen Wise tried to get the president to approve a World Jewish Congress relief program for some of the Nazi satellite countries. And Roosevelt told Morgenthau to follow up and to help this through. So my reading of the sequence of events is that Karski had an influence. It was muffled by the State Department, which began to fight the Treasury, but it ultimately got approved and contributed to the formation of the War Refugee Board. I think it was a very useful meeting. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Yes, I'm 83 years old, and so at the beginning of the Second World War, in September 1st, 1939, I was 7 years old. Nevertheless, me, my parents, and myself, who lived in an apartment in the Bronx at the time, were very interested in what was going around the world and around us. And of course, because of our heritage, we were very interested. In the late 30s, it was clear to me that there was an enormous isolationist feeling in the United States, particularly in Congress. The name Burt Wheeler comes to mind, who was, I believe, a senator from the Midwest. Isolationist sentiment was extremely strong. The desire not to get into war was very strong. There were uniformed neo-Nazis, the brown shirts and black shirts who were marching, who were very frightening to us.
Sir, I'm sorry, if I could ask you to get to a question, please. Thank you.
From what you've said, you said that it would seem from Roosevelt's point of view, let's talk about FDR, that Roosevelt's point of view was the best thing he could do was process the war as best he could and end it as soon as he could. I don't have any information that would disagree with that judgment, that the best thing to do was to fight the war and to win it as soon as possible. Do you have any alternate views? Are there any alternate views that said that Roosevelt could have done something else?
Thank you. Let's take a couple more and then we'll answer. Yes, sir.
I have a question, and you know what? I buy your book. So I'm happy after I, spend my money.
By the way, books are for sale and available for signing upstairs after. Yes.
I recommend this book more than this book from the guy.
Don't meet Jay in a dark alley after the program.
But this is my question.
Yes.
It's about the context of United States. When historians talk about the Jewish and all the dilemma that we have with the Holocaust and all that, for the people, the new generation, they say, wow, this is fantastic. It's beautiful, read the history, know what's going on. But one thing that I today hear, I'm listening everybody, but I feel a little bit isolated because you know what? Nobody talk about the racial discrimination in the United States. Of course, with that situation, nobody can understand FDR because, in the time that he was president, we have a serious problem with discrimination here in the United States. And I think, I don't know why, historians, they don't talk about that part of the history because we're going to understand more easy what's going on, And at the same time, what these guys say about—
Sir, if you can get to a question, please. Thank you.
My question is why they minimize, the civil rights issue here in the United States. They don't talk about that, and they want to us, understand the situation of the Jewish. How are we going to understand the situation of the Jewish if they don't understand the situation of the people that they live here in the United States?
Thank you.
And Roosevelt was part of that too.
Thank you. Yes. Let's take one more and then we'll give you a chance to pick and choose what you—
I have a question for Dr. Winik. I'm sort of perplexed when he suggests that Roosevelt, through his speech ability, could have changed American public opinion. Of course, we haven't even talked about all this anti-Semitism that was existing in the United States at that time, or the fact that the Jewish community at that time didn't even want Roosevelt to nominate another Jewish justice to the Supreme Court at that time because of all the anti-Semitism. But even since that time, since the Holocaust, since the lessons of the Holocaust, no president, no American public has agreed or thought about doing anything about the genocide in Cambodia, in Rwanda, in Darfur, in the former Yugoslavia, in Syria today. Even after all those lessons, why do you think Roosevelt could have done, and what could he have done?
Thank you. Okay, so we have domestic racism, we have anti-Semitism, and we have ability to sway public opinion. Which is the appealing fruit for you?
I'll start with the question about disagreeing with Roosevelt's judgment that the win the war was the best way to end all of the problems. I think, look, when Roosevelt learned about what we call the Holocaust, the term wasn't common at the time. It was the fall of 1942. And if the question is, could we have done anything militarily to interfere with the Nazis' mass killing, the answer is no. It's clearly no. We had no capacity then or for a considerable period of time. But military action is not the only way of doing things. We could have done some of the things earlier that the War Refugee Board later pushed, such as putting pressure on neutral countries to take Jews in, promising that if they took refugees in, we would supply aid and we would send them back to their homes or take them in at the end of the war. There were a number of propaganda things that we could have done earlier than we actually did. So that is a fair argument. The argument about winning the war as quickly as possible, yes, that is in general the way to save lives, but there were also other ways to save lives.
I mean, let's not forget that the Holocaust is the defining moral tragedy of our time. I mean, this is not a small thing. It's the systematic industrialized killing of 6 million Jews in the most ghastly way imaginable. So to explore possibilities that we could have done more it's imperative upon us. It's imperative upon us to understand the past. It's imperative to go forward into the future.
I'm being told that we're almost out of time. This woman here, and then that gentleman was waiting, and I'm sorry, sir, I have to cut after that, but the authors will be available after. Yes.
The question that I have is, I taught this period of time in public schools for 10 years. And the question that my kids constantly, middle schoolers and high schoolers, came to me and said, why didn't somebody do something and why didn't we care? Because I went off script with a lot of what was in the books and talked about all this stuff and the public opinion and things. And do you think that the media could have done more to get the facts out, or do you think that they were talking and that the human beings that were listening fell into that trap that sometimes things that are too difficult for us to hear, we sort of let go, for lack of a better way to put it?
Thank you. Yes, sir. Oh, she has the mic. Okay, here it comes back. That's fair enough. Absolutely.
I was just thinking about the fact that, you know, all the Jews were the vast majority that were killed, but there was like 12 million that they exterminated, a combination of other people. And the Nazis weren't the only ones that committed atrocities. You had also the Soviets who did a lot of extermination. They killed like, I don't know, 50,000 of their officers prior to World War II. Then you had the extermination of like 5,000 Polish officers.
If I can hurry you to the question, because we're really out of time.
I'm just wondering, could they have exposed those type of atrocities in order to expose what was going on with the Jews? To the public, would that have made some type of difference?
Well, we were allies with the Soviet Union, and so it would not have been, it just wasn't in the cards to happen during World War II.
And as for the media?
The media, well, to the media done more, yes, obviously. I mean, you know, it was a different media at the time. I think it was a media that wasn't as independent as today's is. And the access of the media to, you know, one of the things that we do today, I think, so powerfully is we bear witness. And we send reporters to Syria, we send reporters to Darfur, we send reporters to Rwanda, and we bring those images on TV, we bring those stories back in newspapers. And I think that was a harder thing in the case we're talking about here, that we didn't have access, obviously, to occupied territory. But generally, yes, I think you're right. I think the media obviously can always do more to bring to light and to galvanize public opinion in at least a way so that it's informed. Now, it's not our job to decide for people or to tell people what to think, but it is our job to help educate them so they have the best information possible. And I would agree with the gentleman over here talking about domestic discrimination too. That's our job too, and that, you know, that's something we should do better.
And I will comment in closing also that this museum in its mission is charged with being a living memorial, not just about the past. And that is why if you go upstairs, you will see pictures from Syria today. And you have seen pictures from Darfur. We were among the first to publicize those. And we are very proud of that. So I'd like you to join me in thanking our panel, and they will be available upstairs. They will also be signing books. If you would like to purchase a book, get your book signed upstairs, please. Thank you.
That was fun.
I gave a chance